Now it says in his bio that Dr. Wright retired as senior pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ in May of 2008. Yet it is very obvious that retired is not an accurate adjective to describe this man of God, as he is still preaching and teaching and offering pastoral leadership throughout this country and around the world. So this week, we have been privileged to have him among us as scholar in residence at Howard University. So we here at the Divinity School are truly blessed to have an opportunity to experience this prophetic preacher, learned scholar, and public intellectual. Dr. Wright will have time to deliver a full lecture, and what I'm hoping is that we can have an engaged conversation with him. This is not a hit and run, so take notes and feel free to dialogue with Dr. Wright on what he has to offer us tonight from his lecture titled Radical Reconciliation. So please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. JWright.
One of the things the Africaners teach us is to always get permission from the elders before you speak on an occasion such as this. Is there anybody here tonight over 80 years of age? May we have your permission to continue? May we have your permission to speak? To Dean Richardson, to Dr. Powell in his absence, to Dr. Byron, to the faculty, administration, and student body of the Howard University School of Divinity, to the alumni, guests, visitors, and friends of our university. I thank you for this invitation, and I thank you for this week of sharing that the cooperating schools, the colleges, and departments have made possible. Point of clarification in terms of Dr. Byron's postscript, and that is academic accuracy. Did you hear us say I retired from the pastorate of Trinity? I was leading a study tour for a church in East Orange, New Jersey, the Humble Presbyterian Church in Ghana, Togo, and Benin. I've been preaching revivals in that church for 25 years, and they heard me talk about the study tours. And they asked me to lead one, and I said, you don't have to have one for you, can come on and do it. They know they want you to lead one for us, and I said, so I read it, and on the last night of the meeting, the chairman of the trustee ministry, whom I know, of course, said, you really retired? I said, from the pastorate. She looked at me and she said, what does that mean? I said, that means no more Negro meetings. Diversity, choir, hospitality, senior choir, and program. I have been wrestling with tonight's presentation because I've been trying to couch it in terms that would not sound like I was preaching to the choir. Students in the School of Divinity, graduates of the school, and especially faculty, already know the works of Boesak, Jerome Ross, Chet Myers, and James Cone. I do not want to offer my observations or material to that part of the audience, which is well versed in those scholars' perspectives. Especially did I wrestle with fear and trepidation because of the powerful and awesome faculty of scholars that you have here 24/7, 365 at the School of Divinity. Recognizing, however, that there would be others from the community who might not know Boesak, Myers, Ross, and Cone. I then had to try to find a way to make the presentation intelligible and interesting to those who don't speak our seminarianese language. There were three factors that played into my wrestling and that have eventuated in what I presented tonight. One factor was something an Afro-American Studies major from Harlem said to me yesterday. He's a straight-A student who has Dr. Gregory Carr singing his praises, and who I understand is a brother to watch out for in the near future. He said to me, after the presentation at Rankin's Chapel, that he thanked me for making my presentation interesting, because most of the lectures he had heard in a public setting, a plenary setting, and a setting like yesterday in Rankin with several different disciplines represented, were full of important information, but were just flat out boring and put him to sleep. He thanked me for making mine interesting enough in conversational style to keep his interest and keep him awake. The second factor was, or is, a chapter that I have been struggling to finish for a book that Dale Andrews and Robert Smith are editing on practical theology. Those practical theologians want me to write in response to one black British theologian and one South African Mormon theologian concerning what is written in the Bible and how it can be translated from conceptual constructs into everyday life on the ground of the local church. That process has been heavily on my mind. As you can imagine, my chapter is late, and those of you who are publishing deadlines can sympathize with my anxiety. The third factor has to do with the last time I spoke in this chapel. Dean Richardson and Dean Byron were asking me when was the last time I was here. I was invited by the school Divinity students to lecture on prophecy, the prophetic calling, and the life of a prophet. I tried to lecture, starting with the biblical antecedents for the Ben Nabim, the sons of prophets, and the factors about their lives that the scriptures don't make too much of, such as their families, their children, etc. I wanted to compare their lives with the lives of prophetic figures like Martin Luther King, Alan Boesak, but I wanted to set up the biblical framework so the audience could see the parallels. The audience that afternoon was mixed also, as tonight's audience is, and my granddaughter was here in this very room that afternoon for my lecture. She's on the back pew. Our baby daughter was on her way here, and they were texting back and forth as I was lecturing. I found out at dinner after the lecture that my 21-year-old granddaughter had sent a text to my daughter saying, I don't know what in the hell he's talking about. That kind of honesty, mixed in with the student's observation yesterday, the chapter that I'm writing, and the overwhelming presence of theological giants, has made me couch my remarks in tonight's lecture in the following manner. You all pray with me for me. 2 years ago, on Christmas morning, I preached for our pastor so he could spend holiday time with his parents and his parents-in-law, who had come to Chicago to be with their children and grandchildren. Trying to prepare sermons with family and in-laws in the house, plus 2 little ones at Christmas time, is not the easiest juggling act in the world. So I said yes to his invitation to preach for him, so he could be freed up to be daddy and to be son. His parents came to worship on Christmas morning, and in between the first and second services of that day, our pastor's mother asked me what I was doing now that I had retired from the pastorate. I shared with her that I was preaching in other churches on Sunday, I was leading study tours to Africa and Brazil, and I was teaching intensive courses at different seminaries. I team taught 2 courses on Black religious thought at Drew University and Drew Seminary in Madison, New Jersey. One course was taught by Dr. Ivan Carruthers. The second course was team taught with my PhD advisor in history of religion, Dr. Charles Long. I team taught another course at the Chicago Theological Seminary on race, religion, and politics since being retired. I team taught that course with Dr. Alan Boesak, one of South Africa's foremost theologians and freedom fighters who has been here to Howard. And in that course, we compared the similarities and the differences between the theologies and the experiences of blacks in South Africa after 400 years of racist rule, culminating in the official legal institution of apartheid in 1948, up to and through the negotiated settlement between the racist Nationalist Party and the leaders of the African National Congress, a settlement which resulted in the release of Madiba and the end of apartheid. Madiba is the affectionate name of President Nelson Mandela. That negotiated settlement not only brought about the end of apartheid, it also led to the first democratic elections in the history of South Africa in which blacks were allowed to vote. And Boesak's course and my course covered the time span from the inception of white supremacy and the theology of the church in South Africa and the United States of America from 400 years ago up through the year 2010 when South Africa elected its 3rd black president, Thabo Mbeki, who followed Nelson Mandela, and there was then 3rd president, Jacob Zuma, who followed Thabo Mbeki. That course covered the similarities and differences between blacks in South Africa, blacks in the United States of America, after 400 years of racist laws in this country, undergirded by the theologies of the country, culminating in the election of the first African-descended president and the role that theology, religion, and the churches played in those two countries. We tried, Alan and I, to cover the good things about theology and religion in those two countries, and the bad things about theology and religion when it came to race and politics in those two countries. I told my pastor's mother that I also taught her intensive each year, and in fact I still teach that intensive each year during the J term at the Samuel Clark School of Theology at Virginia Union. For those of you not familiar with the academic community, the J term intensive is a 4 semesters worth of work covered in 1 week. 36 to 40 hours of class in 1 week. I will be teaching my annual J-term intensive next week at Virginia Union. They call it J-term because it is held in the month of January between the semesters, the fall semester and the spring semester. Someone who overheard me answering, Mrs. Moss, asked me, "What are you teaching at Virginia Union in the seminary there?" And I answered them, "Whatever Dean Kenny says I'm teaching." Dr. John W. Kenny, the Dean of the School of Theology at Virginia Union University, one of the great minds of theological education on the planet, in both the 20th and 21st century, a dual, D-U-A-L, dual PhD from Columbia University Union Theological Seminary in New York. Did his PhD under Dr. James Combs, an author of 13 books. Dr. Kenny assigns me the courses he wants me to teach. The first intensive he assigned me was on liberation theology and black liberation theology, a 44-year-old academic discipline that most Americans never heard of until ignorant media personalities, white and black, savagely started caricaturing the discipline that they knew nothing about during the 2008 election campaign as they tried to scare voters away from the one black presidential candidate who was about to sweep McCain and Palin into the dustbins of history. First intensive Dean Kenny assigned to teach was on liberation theology and black liberation theology, a discipline that was older than 2/3 of the students in my class. The second intensive Dr. Kenny assigned me, let me hold on for just a moment, hold out until last because it pertains to tonight's lecture. The third intensive that Dr. Kenny assigned me to teach was on prophetic proclamation. And the students used the works of Dr. Walter Brueggemann, Dr. Cleophas McBlue, Dr. Margaret McMichael, Dr. Katie Cameron, Dr. Henry Mitchell, Dr. JWright Grant, Dr. Lenore Tubbs Tisdale, Dr. Bill Andrews, Dr. Samuel Clark, and the writings of biblical prophets like Isaiah, Amos, Micah, Jeremiah, whose controversial, inflammatory, and incendiary rantings, Hannity, O'Reilly, Bank, and the other illiterate of the Fourth Estate obviously have never read biblical prophets. Next week, Dr. Kenny has been teaching a wide spectrum of theologies from his experience from Henry William Turner through Danny Grace, and from T.D. Jakes and Creflo Dollar through James Cole, Jackie Grant, and Katie Cannon. Now, back to the second intensive Dean Kenny assigned me to teach. The second intensive, a full academic semester's worth of work that he assigned me was on, he sent me another, Christianity in Africa. When I saw the title of the course, I called the dean immediately. I wanted to know what he wanted me to cover in one semester, a week. Semester crammed into a week. A topic as broad as Christianity in Africa will take a minimum of 15 to 20 different courses to cover 21 centuries. Christianity started in Africa. Did he want me to cover the works of the African theologians in the patristic period? One can do an entire course on Cyprian, Tertullian, Athanasius, and several courses on Augustine. Did he want me to cover African Christianity as it conflicted with and separated itself from Constantinian Christianity, the imperial theology of Roman Christianity? Did he want me to cover the Ethiopian Orthodox churches, the Coptic church, Christianity in Africa before the trans-Saharan slave trade, during the trans-Saharan slave trade, Christianity in Africa coexisting and or clashing with Islam in Africa, Christianity in Africa and African traditional religions, similarities and differences, Christianity in Africa before, during, and after the European slave trade. Dr. L.H. Welch refuses to call the European slave trade the transatlantic slave trade. Welch said, don't blame slavery on an ocean. Spade, it was the Europeans trading human flesh, not the Atlantic Ocean. I asked Dr. Kenny, did he want me to teach a course restricted to Christianity in Africa once the white missionary effort started with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, which was founded in 1702 by the Anglican Church, the Church of England, the Episcopal Church? Or did he want me to start with Christianity in Africa with Portugal, Spain, and the Catholic Church in Africa? Slave traders in Rwanda prior to, during, and after the BGFP and the Anglican Church effort. I asked him, did he want me to start with Catholic priests in Angola baptizing Africans before they boarded ships bound for the New World and the colonies that Portugal and Spain had in the New World? Or did he want me to compare and contrast what white missionaries in Africa took to the continent as opposed to what black missionaries started with Mark Carey in 1821, took to the continent? And remember, after the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 85, there were then 54 different countries on the continent of Africa, and Christianity in Africa, in Liberia, was not the same as Christianity in Africa in Ethiopia, or Christianity in Africa in South Africa. And then after the early 1900s, with the birth of Pentecostalism in the United States and the Pentecostal mission to Africa, the surprise that the missionaries ran into when they discovered that African Pentecostalism had preceded the Azusa Street Revival. William Seymour, Charles Harrison Mason, and the tongue speaking in California. Africans have never heard of that. They were speaking in tongues long before Seymour was born. Guess what part of African Christianity, or Christianity in Africa, that Dean wanted to cover in one course? Plus, he assigned me that course topic right after my good friend, Dr. Obubuki Kalu, had died. Many of you at the Howard University School really knew Dr. Kalu. Some of you have read his work. A man all by himself, also Nigerian theologian, scholar, church historian. Dr. Kalu had written before he died, and that is 18 books, 189 articles, that completed the manuscript on his 19th book. Died suddenly. Then his wife, who used to work at our church in the counseling center, today a psychologist, Dr. Wilhelmina Kalu, after her husband died, collected all his unpublished works and printed them in 3 volumes, 400 plus pages each. Volume 1, African Pentecostalism, Global Discourses, Migrations, Exchanges, and Connections, 422 pages. Volume 2, Christian Missions in Africa, Success, Ferment, and Trauma, that's 610 pages. I said my students are going to have a fit if they see this on the bibliography. Volume number 3, Religion in Africa, Conflicts, Politics, and Social Ethics, 428 pages, which covered topics as wide-ranging as African Protestant theology, James Cone's Legacy in Africa, Confession as Political Praxis in the Kairos document, which we'll say more about in tonight's lecture, all the way up through an analysis of feminine discourse in Ebony Stokes' study of the Circle for Women, African women theologians that Mercy Amba Oduyoye started. It would take 3 full semesters to cover just the works of Dr. Obu Kalu on Christianity in Africa. Not to mention the other African and African-American scholars in religions who have published in this discipline, from Randy Bailey and Kane Hopefelder, to Desmond Tutu, from Alan Boesak to Dwight Hopkins, from Linda Thomas to Gabriel Wilmore. I asked Dean Kinney just what did he want one academic course on Christianity in Africa to cover, which brings me to the title that I assigned to the presentation tonight. I abbreviated tonight's title to the title that Alan Boesak and Curtis DeYoung, who were just here at Convocation, gave to their powerful book, Radical Reconciliation. And I did that because of the presentation that I made last year in honor of the ANC's 100th anniversary, the African National Congress. I was asked to give a lecture, listen to this audience, to Christians, church members of Trinity, nationalists who don't do church, and academics from the universities in the city of Chicago, Chicago State University, Illinois State University, the University of Illinois, Northwestern University, Malcolm X College, Northeastern Illinois University, and the famous Center for Inner City Studies branch of Northeastern with its Kemetic Institute, Conrad World, our Anderson Thompson, and awesome black scholars who hate the church, white church, the black church, any and all churches. Working my way to the title of that presentation, and the content of that presentation was in and of itself a comedy of errors. Let me explain. I was contacted in retirement by members of the African Ministry of Trinity United Church of Christ and members of the ANC Centenary Committee to talk about the role of Trinity Church and the role that Trinity Church had played in the anti-apartheid movement from the 1970s until the election in 1994, when Mandela became the first South African to be the president of a country that had, at the time, 22 million blacks, but had been run by whites who only made up 4 million of the 26 million people living in that country. Thousands of people in Chicago had driven by our church on 95th Street and had been on the bus, or had been on the bus, riding by the church on 95th Street, and they had seen a curious sign in front of our church, Free South Africa. Been there since the 70s, 75. And people, the Centenary Committee said, needed to know what was behind that sign. What caused our congregation to take a stand against apartheid? What kind of theology undergirded that kind of sign? When the average Chicagoan, the average American, African American and European American could not even pronounce apartheid, but was still saying apartheid. The ANC had recognized our congregation's key role in the struggle against the racist Afrikaner government, and the ANC was getting ready to launch a year-long celebration of its founding and its history on January 8th, 1912. That was when it was founded, the day when the ANC was founded. January 8th, 2012 would mark the 100th anniversary of an organization that had grown and gone through several different phases in its development, with extremes as widely disparate as being banned in 1960 by the racist government, through being a government in exile, with its leaders being spread out in exile from Zimbabwe through Europe to England, through the negotiated settlement, which freed Mandela and ended apartheid, to being a government now in power, electing its third black president in 17 years. The South African community in the United States and in South Africa. The Sitoles in Philadelphia and Chicago, the Shishlalis in Chicago and Johannesburg, the Gobas in Durban, the Gobos in Chicago and KwaZulu-Natal, the relatives of Niati in Detroit and Soweto, Winnie Mandela in Soweto, and the Nekfumbadas in Venda and the Canary Islands. The South African community recognized Trinity Church's role in the Free South African movement and the divestment movement. The South African consulate in Chicago, the Bishop Ndungane in Cape Town, the Robben Island Singers, Randall Robinson, and the Trans-African veterans all recognized our congregation's role in the Free South African movement and the anti-apartheid movement. And 13 years ago, the 9 black ANC premiers, and we would call them governors of the 9 legislative provinces in South Africa, brought the Trinity Church congregation to its feet at the 7:30 a.m. worship service one morning, because they acknowledged our congregation's role and the way they acknowledged it in that struggle. That Sunday, in that particular service, is a moment in time that I will never, ever forget. 5 years after the first, 6 years really, after the first democratic elections, when the ANC swept into power, all 9 provinces in South Africa had 9 black premiers, 9 black governors. Those governors came to the United States on a diplomatic mission. They were in Washington, D.C., they were in New York City, Los Angeles. These are the places they went to: Atlanta, Georgia, Chicago, to look at, to listen to learn from, to share with legislatures, law enforcement community, business persons, elected officials, bankers, and the shakers and movers on Wall Street, LaSalle Street, and Capitol Hill. They visited the Senate, the House of Representatives, and they visited the White House. On the weekend that they were in Chicago, our South African members, I thought, lobbied with the South African consulate to get them to worship at Trinity with us. That's what I thought. And I thought that because during the first service, one of our members, South African members, Funeka Sishlali, sent me a note to the pulpit with all 9 of the premier's names printed, so I can acknowledge their presence. With the note being from Funeka, I said to myself, Funeka, and probably Shadrach from Byron, he looked at the council. They want to see if I can pronounce these names. That's what I thought. And I laughed softly because as I looked at the names, there were no click sounds. I was laughing because Funeka had tried in vain for over 20 years. Tanda Mobo, also a member, and Niati, Charles Adams' assistant in Detroit, they had tried since the 1970s to get me to learn all the click sounds from the Zulu language. Now, Korsha is easier for me because there are only 3 click sounds in the Korsha language. The name Korsha, the Q, Uvelim Aki, and the HL, Shlui. Tanda tried to help me learn those words. Funeka tried to make it 4 sounds with the CG sound, and Tanda Momo, roll in front of the mouth, Korsha the side of the mouth, Uvelim Aki, deep in the throat. I looked at the 9 name, saw no click sound. The brothers were from Joburg, Eastern Cape, Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, and Popo, House, hey. I said, I could do this. So I asked the governors to stand as I called their name and announced their policies. The congregation proudly applauded them as they stood, and the governors applauded me and smiled at me because I had pronounced all their names correctly. As they sat down, I was about to move on with the other pastoral concerns emphasized on for that particular Sunday in worship, when the Holy Spirit whispered to me, asked them if they had anything to say. I asked, and one of them stood up and said, I have something to say, Pastor. His name is Terra Lakota. I took the handheld mic over to him. They were seated about 6 rows back from the pulpit. And as I walked toward him with the microphone, Mr. JWright, our musician for 30 years, started playing softly on the organ. Because he was written in 1897. 15 years before the ANC was founded, it was written by Enoch Sontongo, Methodist school teacher, member of the Christian Church in Africa. Sontongo wrote it originally as a church hymn, translated, God bless Africa, raise high its glory. But the song, the hymn, the sacred anthem later became an act of political defiance against the racist apartheid government. The first 2 lines of the song, the first stanza, are written in Xhosa. The last 2 lines of the stanza are written in Zulu. Nkosi sikileli Africa, balophakamisiwe phongoliwayo, then in Zulu, yizwe imithandazo yethu Nkosi sikilenga, thina basapulwayo. And while Mr. Bradford was playing that song softly, the premier, the governor, Terra Lakota, told the church of York. He said, I was a prisoner on Robben Island for over 10 of the years of Anita. Nelson Mandela was also a prisoner on Robben Island. My cell was next to Anita's cell for a season on that island. He said, on that island we had no hope. On Robben Island we were told that we would be there for the rest of our lives. We were told we would die there on Robben Island, and some of us did. And as we watched our colleagues and comrades died on the island, we did not know if we would ever see freedom. We would ever see our families again, our wives, our children, our mothers, our fathers, our homes. We didn't know if apartheid would ever end or ever be over. But we did know of a black church in the city of Chicago. We were told of a black congregation on 95th Street in Chicago that had a Free South Africa sign in front of it, whose members fought for our freedom and prayed for our safety. And since we knew of that one black church in Chicago on 95th Street with a Free South Africa sign in front of it, we made a pact. We swore, we promised that if any one of us made it off that island alive and ever got the chance to come to Chicago in the United States of America, we would say thank you on behalf of the rest of us who did not make it off that island. And we would say thank you on behalf of all those who died on that island, holding on to the hope demonstrated by that one black church. And so, on behalf of Robert Subukwe, we say, Siyamonga. On behalf, and he called the names of 7 others who had died on Robben Island, saying after each of the names, thank you in Zulu, Siyamonga. I couldn't stop the tears flowing down my cheeks. I kept saying to myself, come on now, you got the rest of the service to make. You got to preach 3 times today. The congregation was on its feet honoring those who had died. But I was humbled beyond description. The ANC premier was honoring us. We used to have ANC banners in front of both of our properties on 95th Street in honor of them and their struggle for freedom, in honor of their struggle to end apartheid. And here was an elected official of the ANC honoring us for what he'd heard about us while in prison on Robben Island. It wasn't because of Funeka and Tonga lobbying to get them to our church. It was because of a pact they had made during apartheid. Long before they met Funeka and Tonga, it was because of the providence of God that they stood in our sanctuary and thanked us, as they thanked God for what we had done to make their dream of freedom a reality. Because of our ministry, they had the audacity to hope. The theology which undergirded our ministry, the theology which was foundational to our anti-apartheid stance, the theology which nurtured our resolve, and the theology of the framers of the Kairos document was the same theology. It is that same theology that shaped my pastorate for 36 years and made my ministry what it was for that season in our life. Well, on the weekend that the ANC was to begin its year-long centenary celebration, I was asked to lecture about our relationship to the ANC, our involvement in the anti-apartheid campaign, and our work in the Free South African movement. Not a problem, I could do that in my sleep. We had a two-hour brainstorming session on Sunday afternoon with members of the ANC Centenary Committee. I preached twice that day. 2-hour meeting. I was even told that on Sunday the 8th of January last year, the actual 100th birthday date of the ANC, the Chicago observers of the ANC observations would be simulcast. That observers would be simulcast, so all South Africans in South Africa could watch it in Johannesburg and Soweto, in Durban, in KwaZulu-Natal, in Rockville, Pretoria, Venda, Lesotho, Swaziland, Cape Town, Guguletu, Khayelitsha, Langa. South Africans all over the country could join with us in Chicago as we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the ANC. Now, I knew there was an 8-hour time difference between Chicago and South Africa, which meant that at 2:30 p.m. they would have a panel discussion. That would be 10:30 at night. Our time in Ladysmith. And a 7 p.m. Chicago lecture that night would be 3 o'clock in the morning in Somerset West. But then when the committee members kept talking to me, they told me that the Sunday January worship services that Sunday morning will be simulcast. That meant 7 a.m. Chicago time will be 3 in the afternoon in Alexandria. And 11 o'clock worship service will be 7 in the evening in Sharpeville. I knew Pastor Moss, our pastor, was preaching our 11 a.m. service, so I immediately called Father Michael Flaker to see if a black South African, his assistant pastor, Reverend Father Tulani De Magwaza, could preach at his 7 a.m. mass. He said yes immediately. What a fitting kickoff for 100 years celebration of black South African Christians in America, honoring the work of the ANC, whose Christian president, Chief Albert Luthuli, a black South African, was the first South African, black or white, to win the Nobel Peace Prize. I then began to get my thoughts and my notes in order to talk about the connection between Trinity Church and the ANC. Trinity Church is a part of a denomination which had ties to South Africa long before there was an ANC. Inanda Seminary, our denomination seminary, started in 1869. Our congregation's denomination, we had long and strong ties to Africa. One of the congregation's charter members, Mary McDowell, her father-in-law, Henry Curtis McDowell, was the first African-American congregational UCC missionary to Southern Africa and South Africa. He served the Christian church in Africa in Angola for 40 years. And while I was getting my notes together, I saw the first title printed for my proposed lecture. And the title read, "The Role of the Church in Africa." And I hit the electronic panic, but maybe you did. I said, "You're kidding me, right?" That title they assigned me sounded like Dr. John Kenny, DeYoung. I said to the Centenary Committee, the church has been in Africa since the days of Jesus. What are you asking me to do? The church has had a role in Africa since the disciple John Mark founded the congregation in Egypt in the first millennium. What are you all talking about? How did the ANC Centenary Committee morph what we talked about into your published title, "The Role of the Church in Africa"? Jesus was African. His father was African. Arthur Kester, a Scottish scholar, in his book, The 13th Tribe, demonstrates how you don't even get European Jews until the 700 AD, or CE if you're not a Christian here tonight. What does the committee mean? The role of the church in Africa. Then on top of that, the electronic newsletter came out from our church, and the press release came out that our church put out. And the several courses that I shared with Dr. Kenny, a full PhD program, got condensed to a 2-hour lecture with a 2-pronged focus. Here was the new title I was assigned to address: "The Historic Role of the Church in Africa and," please note the word "and" in their new title, "The Historic Role of the Church in Africa and the Historical Role of Trinity United Church of Christ in Africa." Now the word South, as in the country of South Africa, where the ANC was founded, never made it into either of the foci for the new assignment I was given as we kicked off the centenary celebration of the ANC weekend. Plus, there's no way that I could lecture on either one of those two very different topics in one 16-week academic course each, much less 1 hour each. So having said that, just let me chronicle for you how the theology that Boesak writes about and radical reconciliation, the theological perspective out of which he, Desmond Tutu, and Curtis DeYoung operate, and how the theologies of Jerome Ross, James Cone, and Chad Myers all impacted the 40-year history I was familiar with when it comes to our congregational denominational relationship with the African National Congress, the anti-apartheid movement, the Free South Africa campaign, and those of you who read the book, The Truth and Reconciliation Commission. For our visitors not of the seminary community here tonight, Ched Myers argues that it is impossible to separate Jesus from the politics of his day. And it is impossible to call ourselves Christians and say we have nothing to do with politics. To do so is to do violence to the ministry and the meaning of Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of the living God. James Cone, as you all know, is the father of systematized black theology, which argues that God comes into history on the side of the oppressed, and that God has a preferential option for the poor. Jerome Ross, formerly of Virginia University Hebrew Bible professor, points out, as do all Hebrew Bible scholars with integrity, that every word in our Bible was written under one of 6 different kinds of oppression. He goes further to show the affinity between the Yahwists and African Americans. And he argues that the affinity there offers a hermeneutic for homiletics. Non-seminarian types, that means a lens through which to look in order to do preaching with integrity. Boesak and DeYoung, of course, speak from the perspective of the oppressed in South Africa and America. And they offer a telling critique of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. For me and for our purposes tonight, here's what all of that looks like on the ground. In 1972, when I started as pastor of Trinity Church, I was pulled into a world of the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ, the world of Dr. Charles Cobb, Attorney Irv Joyner and Elsie Scott, Donald Smith, and the Black Caucus of the United Church of Christ. I met, rubbed elbows with, and began to be exposed to the work of Dr. Yvonne Delp, Dr. Reuben Shears, Dr. Gary Oniki, and the Christians whose worldview was much broader than the local church, much broader than worship on Sunday and great praise and worship. I met Dr. James Cone shortly after the publication of his first 2 books, Black Theology, Black Power, Black Theology and Liberation. Dr. Cone was the man who interviewed me from a Rockefeller Fellowship. The money from the Fund for Theological Education that kept groceries on the table for my 2 oldest daughters, thank you, Jesus. Between Dr. Charles Cobb, Dr. James Cone, my advisor, Dr. Charles Long, Dr. Yvonne Delp, Dr. Gabriel Noah, I was being exposed to a world of black Christian thought that spanned all the way from the Black Atlantic in the 3 Americas to the townships in South Africa and the South African Council of Churches. It was in those same years, 1972, 1973, the year that Alan Boesak was in the States learning from James Cone and Gabriel Noah, that I met and became close friends and colleagues with the cluster of black South Africans, Dr. Bongandala Goba, Dr. Tanda Mogo, Dr. Elkin Sitole. That was before Funeka Sitlami joined our church. Important footnote, which is to say I was going to leave this manuscript. I did not get a chance to talk about this yesterday with the music lecture at Rankin Chapel. But having been immersed in black sacred music of Africans on the continent and Africans in the Atlantic diaspora, the Black Atlantic, since 1968 with Dr. John Lavelle, it was 1975, 7 years later, that I had something hit me in the face that I felt so cheated about in terms of the miseducation Carter G. Woodson says we end in this country. Those of you who've ever been to our church, and I know you worship well, you worshiped here in 2005. My musician and I had a pact. It was in his job description in worship meetings. You may have noticed, or it might have been so subtle that you didn't notice, that from the time service starts until I preach, music never stops. At the end of my sermon, the music picks up again. If I started an invocation, if the deacon started an invocation, all our stretch my hand and then Mr. Becker would start playing, very soft. Behind the scriptures, behind the prayer, behind the knelt of music. The only time the organ went dead, except for one thing I gotta tell you about, was when Mr. Rapper pulled his hand off the keyboard, which meant we were getting ready to do a common meter, a long meter, or a short meter song. Many of you don't know that name when as young, you call it Dr. Watts. Songs written by Iris Sandy, Charles Wesley, John Wesley, and the medical doctor Isaac Watts, that we call Dr. Watts. When his hand came off, that meant that Dr. Watts was going to start. Footnote sidebar for one other exception, that the only other time the music stopped while Mr. Bradford was alive. Before computers, before iPads, iPods, and Twitter, tweet, and email, I used to have to call in my music, my scripture, and my sermon, 3 different sermons every Sunday, to the church office. And I had to call it in by Thursday because Mr. Bradford met with the choir rehearsal, and he needed to know what songs to go over. If I hadn't called in by Thursday night, Mr. Bradford would call the office to find out what the scripture was for that Sunday, and then he would go to the scripture and pick songs related to that scripture so that he'd be playing something and going over something at least in the same ballpark where the sermons were coming from. This one day I called my executive minister, Reverend Barbara Allen. I gave her 7:30, 11, and 6 o'clock scripture, sermon, and I picked the hymn of the morning, which is related to the sermon pastors. The altar call, which is related to the sermon pastors. And the invitation is related to the sermon pastors. I picked those songs. I did all 3 services, and Reverend Barbara was reading them back to me. She said, "You forgot the altar call for 11 o'clock. I spent 35, 40 minutes getting this together. I said, "Tell Jeffrey, because we've been working together here 25 years, whatever he wants." I didn't church that Sunday. Service was flowing along smoothly, 11 o'clock service, and the organ went dead. And I'm saying, "Oh, we're doing a common meter here." I didn't even see Mother Trippett. Mother Trippett did our common meter hymn. Sadie Trippett. She was an elder who learned those songs from her grandmother from Malagasy, or what we call Madagascar. Mother Trippett not here. Who will lead the common meter? Maybe he wanted me to lead that. I'm going to go with the organ. He wasn't there. And then Brian started on the electronic piano. I put some music in the dead space. Mr. Bradley got off the organ and was walking around, and he bent down right next to me. He came. He said, "Ram." I said, What's going on?" He said, "Could you hum a few measures of whatever he wants?" I said, "What?" That's what I said. Jesus wants in 75, after Tommy Vogel, the first minister to be ordained in the congregation, was ordained, she was standing with me behind the communion table. And that was in the days when you had no cute little cups. But I'd love to see you ladies with your long fingernails trying to get that plastic up off. We didn't have that. We had bread goes out first, and then the wine goes out second, and then the deacons collect them glasses from the wine. We got to wash them and use them next communion Sunday. And between the bread and the wine, Jeffrey's hand came off the organ and Mama Trippett started. "I love the Lord, He heard my cry." The congregation responded. "I love," and Tommy started singing along with us in Zulu. And Tommy, she kept on singing, just grinning and smiling. Well, at the end of the service, when they were collecting the glasses, she said, "It was so nice of Dr. Sitole to come and teach you that song." I said, "To teach us what song?" Dr. Elkin Sitole, South African ethnomusicologist, came to our church and taught us African songs. And she thought he had come and taught us that song. I said, "What song?" And she started singing it again. She was singing the tune to "I Love the Lord, He Heard My Cry." I said, "Dr. Sitole did not teach us that song. Black people have been singing that song since 1800. She said, no, they sing that song in my village today while Zulu Natal. We took the words of Isaac Watts and put them to an African tune, and nobody ever taught us that. Well, it was that circle of friends, Dr. Tommy Vogel, Dr. Alkin Sitole, who introduced me to what was really going on in South Africa in the years 72, 73, 74, 75. contrary to the corporate-owned media lies, the United States citizens were being fed by the print media and by television. Dr. Goba, Tandalobo, Dr. Sitole opened my eyes and opened the eyes of our congregation to what was really happening to blacks in South Africa under the racist Afrikaner regime and the sick, suffocating system of apartheid, undergirded by the theology of the Dutch Afrikaner Church. Tanda and Bongo shared with our congregation videotapes smuggled out of South Africa of the Sharpeville Massacre, the treatment of blacks by the Gestapo-like police in their country, white and black. We even showed clips from South Africa, the Soweto uprising during our Mojukarano Thanksgiving service in the mid-1970s. Through Tanda, we became intimately and personally aware of Inanda Seminary in KwaZulu-Natal. Tanda had been a student there and had graduated from Inanda Seminary. As I said earlier, Inanda had been started by the United Church of Christ through the American Missionary Association in 1869. It was a high school, it was called a seminary. It still is a high school for poor black South African girls who had no chance of the possibility of college or graduate school, given the Bantu education offered to black students in the 1860s and the Bantu education offered up through 1960. It was in March of 60 that the Sharpeville Massacre took place over that issue of Bantu education. It was from Tanda that we learned the not so widely known or talked about facts about Chief Albert Lutuli's life. The world came to know Chief Albert Lutuli as the president of the African National Congress, whose anniversary we celebrated last year. The world came to know Chief Albert Lutuli as the first South African ever to win a Nobel Peace Prize. The world came to know Chief Albert Lutuli as the black South African who stood before that lily white august body, receiving that prize and giving his acceptance speech wearing the warrior hat of a Zulu chief. An outfit, incidentally, that he only wore probably one other time in his life, and that was at the wedding of his daughter. The world came to know Chief Albert Lutuli as the man whom John Kennedy's brother, Senator Robert Kennedy, went to visit in June of 1966 at Lutuli's home in Groutville, KwaZulu-Natal. While Lutuli was banned by the racist African government, Kennedy went to pay his respects. Kennedy went to pay Lutuli homage. Robert Kennedy went to honor Lutuli's work for peace and for non-violent resistance to the racism which ruled South Africa. Patanda shared with us the parts about Lutuli's life that the world tends to gloss over. Lutuli was a Christian. This is a crucial part of the role of the church in South Africa that too often gets glossed over. Lutuli said, quote, "The way to freedom is by way of the cross," end quote. Lutuli said, "I am in politics because of my faith." Lutuli was not only a Christian, Lutuli was not only an active member of a congregation, not a politician who dropped by the church at election time or near election time, but the Chief Albert Lutuli, president of the African National Congress, was a deacon. I mean, an every Sunday in church communion sermon writing deacon, sermon preaching deacon at a UCC church. The Groutville Congregational UCC stands for, in South Africa, UCC, United Congregational Church of South Africa. And Deacon Lutuli's remains today are buried in the cemetery behind that church. Tanda's name is well known and respected in that same church, incidentally. In 1975, the year Ben Chavis of the Commission for Racial Justice was sentenced to return to prison, and the Supreme Court of this country refused the request for writ of certiorari for the Wilmington. In that same year, 1975, Reverend Tanda Momo was ordained in our sanctuary, and Dr. Boesak and gave Tanda her charge to the ministry in Zulu, invoking the names of blacks who had given their lives so that she could be standing where she was standing on 95th Street in Chicago. Bongo called out the names like the ANC Premier Terry Lakota did 25 years later, pausing between each name. But when Bongo said Sobukwe, Madiba, Steve Biko, Shaka, and the Zulu word for God, Ulinkaki, Ukulunkulu, that same lump in my throat that I was experiencing a quarter of a century later jumped all over me. Another reason it was such an emotional moment for me was because of the letter and the gift that Tanda's father had sent me on the occasion of her ordination. Bogadala Boba called her daddy's name and giving her the charge to ministry. Tanda Boba's graduation from seminary was an important occasion, a first, a benchmark in the life, the story, and the narrative of her family, her people, and the members of her extended family in KwaZulu-Natal. The family scraped together with the extended family, giving what they could so that her daddy could ride from KwaZulu-Natal up to Joburg and then fly from Johannesburg to New York and Chicago to see his baby girl, a graduate of Chicago Theological Seminary, a UCC seminary, ordained into the Christian ministry at a sister UCC church. We were a small black church back then, just like her church, a small church like her daddy's church. The Setoles would be there, the Gobas would be there, South Africans in exile like Dennis Brutus would be there, the academic community from Hyde Park, and the church community of Trinity would all be there. A woman, a black South African woman, a Nobo, had finished graduate school and was being ordained. Her father was on cloud 9. And the racist South African government would not grant him a visa to come see his daughter receive that honor. Trapped in South Africa, appeals to the United States Embassy in vain. Remember, the United States government supported the South African government.
Right. That's right.
The United States government branded the ANC, African National Congress, as a communist organization,
Right.
with a Christian deacon as its president. Sounds like Tea Party is called a Christian and a Muslim in America, isn't it? That was a preview of the Tea Party mentality. The United States government would not help, the South African government would not budge, no visa, no visit. No high moment for Reverend Mobo, male or female in the flesh. So Reverend Mobo, her daddy, sent me a Zulu war shield, a leopard skin and the cross spear and club behind the shield as a gift. And the note Reverend Mobo wrote to me said, quote, "You are our Zulu warrior on that side of the Atlantic. I present you the symbols of your office and tokens of our love and appreciation. Because of the racism of our two governments, I am not permitted to cross the body of water that separates our two countries. So I will not get to meet you in person on this occasion. But because of the righteousness of our God, when you cross the other body of water that separates time from eternity, I will be waiting for you there. I am much older than you, but I will precede you to that other shore. But when you cross over, I will meet you and thank you face to face. See you long." Our ties to the South African community were sealed for all time and for eternity. 1976, the Soweto murder of Hector Peterson took place. 1976, Dr. Elkin, the ethnomusicologist, continued to come to our church choir rehearsals and teach us songs like I talked about yesterday, Shosholozo, Kules on top. In 1976, Dr. Sitole taught me to listen to the lyrics of Mama Millie Makeba and Ladies with Black Mombasa. In 1976, Steve Biko was arrested because of his involvement with the South African Student Organization and the Black Consciousness Movement. Livonia trials were taking place. Jim Cone and Bob Boesak had already shown us the ties between Steve Biko, Black consciousness, and Black theology. Boesak's Coming In Out the Wilderness, a comparative study of the ethics of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, was also published that same year, 1976. Boesak's Farewell to Innocence, a socio-ethical study of Black theology and Black power, came out in 1977. The same year that Steve Biko was murdered by the Afrikaner government. In our Umoja Corona celebration at Thanksgiving that year, we had a moment of silence in remembrance of and thanksgiving to God for the life of Steve Biko. In 1978, my involvement as a member of the board of directors of TransAfrica opened many more doors and opened my eyes to the magnitude of the anti-apartheid struggle on the international level and to the theology undergirding the ministry that was shaping in our church and being formulated in my heart. My work with the Office for Church and Society of our denomination, I was on directory of the Office of Church and Society, and on the board of trustees of the Commission for Racial Justice. I was a commissioner. That exposed me to the fissures between the Dutch Reformed Church, the Black Dutch Reformed Church, and the white racism of the white Dutch Reformed Church, which supported apartheid as the will of God, the role of the church in South Africa. 79, the same year Alan Boesak made his impassioned plea before the South African Council of Churches, Trinity Church, because of our South African connection, purchased and proudly displayed the Free South African sign in 75, as I said, and it stayed on our front lawn until the end of apartheid, when it was stolen. He's still in the hood, y'all. In those same years, my involvement with the Black Theology Project, Dr. Dr. Wally Dotson, Dr. Howard Dotson, and members of Kate Hope Felder's Group, the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, caused me to catch a glimpse of the global dimensions of the struggle against apartheid. And everything I saw, everything I learned, everything I experienced, I shared with our congregation through our churches, our own church and society ministry. In 1981, my first trip to Cuba with Trans-Africa exposed me to Fidel Castro's role in fighting against apartheid. And I was reminded of that visit, that 1981 visit, when Nelson Mandela was freed, had become a national and international celebrity, and was being interviewed by Ted Koppel. Mr. Koppel tried to criticize President Mandela, the democratically elected President Mandela, because of Mandela's apparent friendship with Castro and the government of Cuba, which was not democratic. And Mandela ate Koppel's lunch. First he said, don't try to make your enemies our enemies. Then he said, during apartheid, Castro sent doctors, medicines, and teachers to help the African National Congress in exile. Your government sent planes, bombs, weapons, and the CIA to help the racist Afrikaner government. The South African troops were trying to intervene in the Namibia-Angolan border dispute. It was Cuban troops that stopped that. A fool can see why we chose not to let you dictate to us who our enemies should be just because they are your enemies. Your friends, the racist South African government, your friends are our enemies. Don't ever forget Dick Cheney called a Christian Nelson Mandela a communist and voted against the United Nations appeal for Mandela's release from prison after having been in jail for over 20 years. The fight against apartheid was global. My subsequent trips to Cuba for the Jornadas Teologías, the theological seminars on the life, work, and ministry of Martin Luther King and its implications for the churches in Cuba and the Caribbean and South America, over and over again caused me to hear from Brazilians, from Haitians, and from Cubans, church folk, academicians, and pastors. The struggle against apartheid was our struggle. The church's struggle, a moral struggle, a theological issue, not just a political issue. In 1983, 84, 85, and 86, they were back-to-back, almost rapid-fire experiences of life-changing import that pertained to our congregation's ongoing struggle against apartheid. First in 82, Reverend Byron Allen and I traveled with 10 other members of the United Church of Christ to Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and over again we heard from the Christians in Costa Rica, Nicaragua. We went there to look at the work of our denomination, but over and over again, even during worship services, we heard them interject a shout out in the middle of church. Entre revolution et Christianidad no hay contradicción. There is no contradiction between revolution and Christianity. That's the theology. And reminiscent of what Dr. Martin Luther King said, called forward in that 1970 speech at Riverside Church, April 4th, we needed a revolution of values. The Christians in those countries where liberation theology was first articulated in the 20th century, those Christians kept drawing parallels between their struggles against the imperial neo-colonialism of the United States government, especially in Nicaragua. Please don't forget our government backed the Somocistas in Nicaragua. Please don't forget Oliver North. Please don't forget the Iran-Contra arms for drugs scheme. Please don't forget the scam and the flooding of South Central Los Angeles with drugs flowing in from Central America in unmarked CIA planes. That ain't nothing Jeremiah Wright made up. That's something that part of their court said loudly. I'm not going to jail by myself. I work for the CIA. Our visit to meet with the FMLN in El Salvador introduced me to the Sandinistas, and that introduction allowed me to dialogue with people who saw the ANC struggle and their struggle as the same struggle. The Encuentro with CISWE, the MK, the military arm of the Youth League of the African National Congress, the Sandinistas saw the MK, the Encuentro with CISWE, as comparable to just one arm of their Sandinista organization, that branch which targeted property for destruction. And the young army captain who was assigned over the unit to provide security for us while we were in Nicaragua. She spoke fluent English, a Sandinista, a master's degree from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Her first year out of school, she told us, she served as a volunteer in an ANC exile camp in Zimbabwe. The fight against apartheid was global. In 1984, when I accompanied Minister Louis Farrakhan to the 15th Jumahiya of the Libya government, not only were the ANC representatives there, but day after day after day, the delegates at the 15th Jumahiya heard praise all day long that Gaddafi had supported the African National Congress in its fight against apartheid to end apartheid. Delegates from Europe, delegates from Asia, delegates from South Africa, supporting the ANC as it struggled to be free. The fight against apartheid was global. The Nation of Islam, the world community of Muslims, African nations, and Europeans were in lockstep with Christians and traditionalists who saw both the European slave trade and apartheid, as well as the treatment of Palestinians as, quote, crimes against humanity. The fight against apartheid was global. The United Democratic Front, a coalition of South African trade unions, communists, Christians, Hindu, atheists, priests, preachers, deacons, lay people, and sangomas all agreed apartheid had to be crushed. In 1985, the South African churches, Dr. Boesak points out something very important. It was grassroots theologians from Soweto, not university or seminary trained, grassroots theologians from Soweto who authored and printed the Kairos Doctrine, a theological statement of the role of the church in South Africa, a theological statement which challenged the church's response to what the authors saw as the vicious policy of the apartheid state under the so-called state of emergency declared by the racist government on July 21st of 1985. The Kairos document evoked strong reactions from conservatives. These things take time. Don't rock the boat. Religion and politics don't mix. House Negroes and white racist Christians, not only in South Africa, but the debates caused by the Kairos document went on worldwide. And Geneva Smitherman's last book, Articulates While Black, or pronounced Articulate While Black. Geneva Smitherman, you must read that. Please put it on, you must read this. She said, because most of America does not understand black speech, does not understand the context of black worship and black worshipers responding to call and response of black preachers, and because most Americans do not know the story of Africans in this country, nor the theology that developed prior to Jim Crow in this country, with Africans saying, before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home. And because they don't know that, Geneva Smitherman says, white folks, when they hear Jeremiah preach, don't know whether the shit or go blind. That's what happened with the Kairos document. Christians did not know whether the shit or go blind when they read. These church people were saying violence might be necessary. It just might be, maybe MK is not something we ought to look into. One of the members of our church, I think I told John Hunter Parker, said, when you see a good fight, get in it. We took the Kairos document, and just as we did Cato Photos of Troubling Biblical Waters, we did a church-wide study on the Kairos document to make the entire membership aware of the demands of the gospel of Jesus Christ in the context of the racist world of South Africa and the racist world of the United States of America. In that same year, the denomination, the United Church, our denomination, voted to divest from any and all businesses and banks doing business with the racist apartheid government of South Africa. Right now, boycott, divest movement is catching on. South Africa just endorsed it to boycott businesses doing any business with Israel until Gaza is settled, until the Palestinians get a fair hearing. Now, the divestment movement was in churches, individual congregations, was in the American Committee on Africa, the Religious Action Network, headed by two black pastors from Harlem, Wyatt T. Walker, Baptist, Canon Fred Williams. Divestment was not new. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus had pushed divestment from South Africa. Various colleges and universities, including Spelman, had tried divestment. But after the Soweto uprisings in '76, for the next 10 years, Leon Sullivan notwithstanding, the divestment movement grew and grew until by the mid-1980s, major white denominations had joined the divestment campaign In our denomination, our church voted to take all of its monies out of banks doing business with South Africa and to boycott any businesses carrying on trade with South African companies, South African corporations, South African concerns. That's the United Church of Christ, both nationally and in the state of Illinois. The United Church of Christ is amazing. That's a title for a book if somebody wants to do your PhD in this area. The United Church of Christ had moved from investment in Africa, concerned in the 1830s with the Amistad case. The United Church of Christ paid for the defense of the Mende people, from investment to divestment in the 1980s, with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and Wall Street deeply involved, from diamonds to defense contracts. And that fight was waged on many disheartening fronts, from our own United Church of Christ pension boards, corporate viewpoint in 1986, to individual personal choices made by members of our congregation, and some members looking at me tonight. Alan Boesak and his wife had me to dinner when I was in South Africa last year, and they were teasing me about Gabriel Blomo. They said, you know what Gabriel Blomo said to us about you? I said, what's that? They said, Gay said, you don't want to mess with Jeremiah, because Jeremiah's street. And I had to go street on pension boards in 1986. Never will forget, it was the same month that my grandson, my oldest grandson, graduate of Howard, was born. We had voted as a denomination for all of our agencies in the United States, the Board for World Ministries, the Board for Homeland Ministries, the Office of the President, the Commission for Racial Justice, Office for Church and Society, the Pension Board, all of the national agencies with monies and holdings all over the world to divest from South Africa. And 1 year later, the Black Caucus invited all of those agency heads to come to our caucus meeting to report where they were in terms of divestment. Some had divested completely, some were waiting for the CD to mature so they would not lose any money before putting it out. Some were in the process of divesting, and the pension board boldly said to a room full of 500 black folks, we have not divested and we are not going to divest. It is not a matter of race or racism, it is a matter of business. We have a fiduciary responsibility to our clients, and we will keep that fiduciary responsibility, getting the best return on our dollars, whether that return comes from Krugerrands or South African diamonds. And the head of the pension board wouldn't even come to the meeting. He sent his assistant to make the report. Reverend James Hargett, pastor of the Park Congregational Church at the time, tried to reason with the young woman for about 15 minutes. He was reasoning with her. She was sticking to her text. She would not budge. This is not a matter of race. This is a matter of business. We have a fiduciary. I went street and ended the meeting. I shut it at the meeting down. I apologize later. I'm glad my mama was nowhere around. I stood up in the back of the room, as far as that mirror back there from her, and shouted at the top of my lungs, that's bullshit. She turned red. I said, you know what? You know what you need? You need a good old-fashioned kitchen ass with it. And now I understand why the PAC, the Pan-African Congress, has opted for violence, and why the MK has opted for violence, because some of y'all don't understand nothing about violence. And you know what? You down here 22nd in Michigan and Chicago, I got me some brothers right here who for 1/5 of a bottle of wine will kick your ass with an amazing grace to a floating out there. Don't say another word. Don't say another word. Just get out. All y'all get out of here from this meeting's over. On the street. There was some disheartening fronts when it came to the divestment issue. It was not only a national board like the pension board, there were some members of our church, and probably some here at this lecture, who would not and who still will not take their money out of white racist banks. Not only who are doing business with South Africa back then, but who are helping the home foreclosure. They're lost right now. Somebody say Bank of America. Or maybe call them over, because I can still be a street. That's disheartening, because you're fighting white folks and fighting black folks over a matter of principle. Trinity United Church of Christ, as a congregation, however, continue to support both the African National Congress and the Pan-African Congress. Representatives of the PAC came to our church, and we lifted it off for them publicly, boldly. As Mandela told Cabo about Cuba, we refused to be backed into an either-or choice. We opted to adopt a both-and approach. Both the ANC and the PAC wanted an end to apartheid, and so did we. By 88 and 89, several different things were going on simultaneously on several different fronts. Some good, some questionable, And those different events impinge upon the church's role in South Africa in the 21st century and the theology undergirding that role, both in South Africa and in the United States of America. The South African Council of Churches' role in South Africa, the role of black theology in South Africa, South African black theology, the role of black Americans in black theology vis-a-vis South Africa, decisions made by the leadership of the African National Congress, and unbeknownst to the vast majority of black South Africans. I speak here of that negotiated settlement I mentioned at the outset, the agreement between the racist de Klerk government and the ANC leadership that brought about both Mandela's release and the end of apartheid. Personal decisions made by people of faith, my wife Amy and I included. 23 to 24 years later, many of those matters are still begging to be addressed. From the implementation of the new South African Constitution, from printed affirmation to policy implementation, from the Christian churches' widely varying positions and the positions of Muslims, Sikhs, Hindi, and other religious traditions on homosexuality. Funeka Sicilani said the Constitution guarantees rights for gays, lesbians, transgenders, but Christians have a hissing. I don't care what the Constitution says. From the intentional creation of a few black millionaires through the black economic empowerment game in the negotiated settlement, to the crushing poverty of the countless millions of black masses of those whom Eugene Robinson here in D.C. would call the abandoned. They still have no homes 18 years later. From the unfinished business of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Boesak and DeYoung write about in Radical Reconciliation, to the ANC's addressing the issues of ethnic cleansing when it comes to the problem of immigrants in Guguletu, or it comes to the church's silence on the issue of ethnic cleansing in Palestine, in Gaza, while preaching prosperity. Get your praise on. Lead me to the king. From the greed and corruption of a few black officials in the ANC, to the racism of the Western Cape, the Democratic Alliance, to the mushrooming of the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the bizarre opinions of some leaders compounded by the fatal mentality and the mythology surrounding the methodology of combating and curing AIDS in South Africa. If you have sex with somebody under 6, you'll be cured. What is the church's role on that playing field in the year 2013? In the hymn Charles Wesley wrote, a charge to keep, I have a God to glorify, never dying soul to save and fitted for the sky. The second verse of that hymn says, to serve this present age, our calling to fulfill, only in all of our powers engaged to do our Savior's will. The present age is not the ANC age of 20 years ago in exile, 50 to 60 years ago after the banning. What is the church's role today when it comes to the ANC? The ANC that just re-elected Zuma with his 4 wives. Most of it, I found out from being here at Howard, most of the Howard person I talked to did not even know that Zuma is a Pentecostal bishop. This present age. Starting back in 88, 89, 90, there was a growing awareness in church circles, especially as that divestment movement escalated and investigated the investments, all the money, and awareness of the uncomfortably connected dots between Zionism and the Republic of South Africa. The gold, the diamonds, the uranium, and the U.S. defense contracts with South Africa as a much-needed uranium supplying ally. The military and the monetary alliances follow the money. In addition to that growing awareness in denominational circles, there was a concomitant growth in theological circles. Still the role of the church in South Africa. Dr. Dwight Hopkins' book, Black Theology, USA and South Africa, introduces the reader to the fundamental differences and similarities between black theology in the United States and black theology in South Africa. 24 years ago, Dr. Hopkins, who's a member of our congregation, Dr. Hopkins, double PhD, one from Union Theology and one from the University of Cape Town in South Africa. 24 years ago, Dr. Hopkins explored such questions as what is the common denominator between black theology in South Africa and black theology in the United States of America. Alan Boesak, parenthetically, in his latest book, dedicated to Gabriel Moore, also asks, does black theology have a word for the world and the church in the year 2013? Or was black theology a passing fad, as some of our delusional post-racial dreamers wish it was? Hopkins examines the historical, the political, the cultural, and theological backgrounds of contemporary black theologies in both countries. Civil disobedience, black consciousness, the unity of politics and culture, theology. Hopkins' works speak to the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Oakland, Occupy American theology of the 21st century, and he wrote the book 24 years ago. That is just a hint of some of the several different things that were set in motion in those years when Dr. Hopkins was in Oakland at the end of the 1980s. He, during those years, Wright, was the personal assistant to Bishop Ndungane, who later became the Archbishop, who succeeded Desmond Tutu as the Archbishop of Cape Town and the Archbishop of Cape. Bishop Ndungane blew me away 5 years ago when our church, 6 years now, went to 2007 on our study tour to South Africa. When we are in West Africa, South Africa was on a Sunday and we're not traveling on that Sunday, I tell our church's travel coordinator, make sure we can get to a worship service that's lively. God knows my lectures are boring enough. And most of the time, most of the folk traveling on those study tours don't want to study, ain't read the material, they're interested only in retail therapy. I've got 2 minutes. Here's somebody who can vouch for that. I know that, I'm not stupid. I've been doing it for 2 decades. So I said, Sydney, at least give us a worship service that we don't have to travel all that stuff. Just go give them a break. So Sydney had picked up this high praise church for us in Cape Town. I mean, it was off the chain. It was in a colored township, the color of the descendants of the original people of South Africa, the Khoikhoi and the San, the Khoisan. In fact, the word Khosha is believed to come from Khoisan, the original South Africans. And man, let me tell you something, they were getting it on before the call to worship. They were jamming, and I was jamming. When the guy came over, the South African guy came over to where my wife and I was sitting, he said, Reverend Wright, come with me. I stood up, I handed my camera to a little group of the congregation, our church sitting next to me. He said, no, bring all these in. He then took us out of the church, put us in a Lincoln Town car. I looked at Raymond and said, where we going? She was like, how would I know? How would you? He drove us out of the township, outside of Cape Town, away from the praise and worship. It took us into this exclusive, very rich section of Cape Town, with nobody on the street looked like us. He stopped in front of this Anglican church where everybody going in was white, Afrikaners, Moors, 12 years after apartheid. He said, I'll be back to pick you up. Have them call me when service is over. Who? What them? I don't know nobody up in here. No one know nobody up in here. And sure enough, you're talking about sedate choir, sedate South African Anglican worship. The pipe organ when we walked in was playing a fugue in C minor of the prelude. Then we all stood for the processional, and all the folks coming down the aisle were white, except this one black guy. He looked familiar. But I don't want to be like, oh, y'all look alike. So I just watched looking from side to side. I mean, they were singing in Afrikaans. The liturgist was reading in Afrikaans and Latin. I said under my breath, I'm going to kill Sydney. I left Kirk Franklin for the Ku Klux Klan. The hat that the black guy had on looked like the hat of the dragon. They introduced the black guy, and when they introduced him, they said the name Archbishop Ndungane. I said, well, that's where I know him from. I remember way back in 1988 in Oakland when I was at Alum. He preached that Sunday in Cape Town in Afrikaans for the congregation. I have no idea what he said. As we were going through the door following service, leaving the sanctuary, I reached out to shake his hand. I said, Bishop, you don't know me. But he cut me off and said, don't know you. Hadassah. When you forget who you are, that's when you preach that. The audacity to hope. What makes you so strong, black man? He said, how could I not know you? I had never heard preaching like that in my life until I heard you. I sent for you to come here this morning because Dwight Hopkins told me you were leading a study tour in South Africa. And I found out where you were. Now, JWright, he said, we have got to reactivate the dialogue between black theologians and black pastors in the United States and black theologians and black pastors in South Africa. Too many black academicians and too many black politicians are writing history now as if the church had nothing to do with the struggle. And the church has had everything to do with the struggle from the 19th century up until today. This is not in total, this is just a hint of some of the different things that were set in motion in those years, 89 and 90. I met Bishop Ndungane through Wright Hopkins in 88. Dr. Hopkins, incidentally, came to our church, and just as we did with Kano Felder, with the Kairos doctor, we did a church-wide study on his book. The similarities and differences between the role of the church in South Africa and the role of the church in the United States of America, and the theology undergirding that struggle for freedom. It was also in 1988 that my wife and I made a personal decision not to buy any diamonds for her engagement ring or for her wedding band, not to buy any diamonds until Nelson Mandela was out of prison and apartheid was over. Why? Because of the diamond mines in South Africa and the connection between South African diamonds, South American diamonds, and blood diamonds. I have tonight in my briefcase a gift from my play daughter who lived and worked in South Africa. It is a prison bracelet engraved on it. Is the number 46664. That's Mandela's prison number. Beneath that number is engraved February 11, 1990, the date Mandela was released from prison. By the late 1880s and 1990s, several different things were going on that impinge upon the church's role and individual believers' role in South Africa and in the United States of America tonight in 2013. I celebrated that year-long series of events commemorating the journey of 100 years with the African National Congress. I celebrate the theology of the oppressed. I celebrate the theology of my people. And I thank you for allowing me to share with you this week and tonight from a perspective that has made my life richer, sweeter, and full of siyabonga.
Thank you, Dr. Wright, very much for that very inspiring lecture. We do have time for questions, some engagement of Dr. Wright, some further clarification on some of the many issues he raised and the story he told. So just come up to the mic as you are led.
Dr. Wright, thank you for your scholarship. I just want to ask about this new phenomenon that the prosperity preaching is taking root here in America and your assessment of it. And do you think it has wings, and do you think we'll have the stamina to rule out this black theology that they're striving to do? And then the second question, I just want you to speak about the stronghold of the Israeli lobby here in America and how they're moving in the black neighborhoods, striving to make their presence felt.
Prosperity gospel. Jonathan Walton, I recommend this book to you. Jonathan Walton's book. What did it say again?
Watch this.
Watch this. Watch this. Watch this. Watch this. Watch this. He does a thorough and very important analysis of that theology. It's not new. I don't think it's lasting. And I think many people who flock to hope, it's like playing about it, hoping to get rich, or finding out that they're only Bentley or the parking lot is still the pastor. Coming out, we just drove this week as you went last week. I think that people are getting to see, particularly after the nation took its dive economically, that's a height, and the only person that you make it rich is the bishop, or the apostle, or the super apostle, or the preacher, whatever the name is. So I don't think it's lasting. Unfortunately, the second part of your question is this. Most African Americans, that's one of the reasons Dale Parkinson, Robert Smith have me write it. They already have a couple of books out. This book, this chapter on practical theology. Most African American Christians have no clue about Black Church. They got nothing to do with Prosperity Church. They just don't know. I'm going to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to Lancaster next week after this. And of course, the folk who asked to go blind, I had a stroke about my coming to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Dutch country, based on their comprehensive knowledge of me from Fox News. And so they ran straight to a black preacher. He's not Prosperity, he's just conservative, National Baptist, Missionary Baptist Church. He said, we don't do black theology, we just preach Jesus and him crucified. Well, see, that kind of ignorance is the kind of ignorance you find in most of the churches. Please remember, we have a seminary. Most African-American clergy persons don't go to seminary. They look at it as a cemetery. So they have, I mean, Cone, what's that, 1968, that's 46 years, 44 years, they ain't read nothing. Well, first of all, they can't read Cone, they can't read the paper. Washington Post is written at the 6th grade level. So you give a book like Cone or Jackie's or Katie County, they don't read that. And they don't know anything at all about their history or their story as Africans in this country. So they don't know the struggle. They just know Jesus and him crucified. They're not going to read the cross and the lynching tree to find out about Jesus and him crucified. And they're not going to read anything at all about the origins of Christianity, where Christianity started. They know Joel Osteen, just like they knew Billy Graham. They know Creflo Dollar. They used to know Eddie Long. But they don't know black theology. It's not so prosperity gospel doesn't compete with theology in black gospel at all. Now in terms of the AIPAC and that lobby, the J Street lobby and all that, I don't know how many persons in the room tonight are of the Fourth Estate, so I'm going to answer this question like two porcupines making love very carefully. It is unfortunate. It is very unfortunate. Especially is it unfortunate in that all Jewish persons do not agree with what they're doing. All Jewish persons are not fighting Palestinians or happy with what's going on in Gaza. But the money, the PR, the media, and the presentation that's made to the public makes it seem like that. And that's very, very unfortunate. Tikkun, T-I-K-K-U-N, is a publication you can Google and subscribe to, published by Rabbi Michael Lerner. Gives you a different perspective of many persons of the Jewish faith who are not buying into AIPAC, T-I-K-K-U-N, Rabbi Michael Lerner. And also one I've been subscribing to 20 years now, The Link, L-I-N-K, The Link, published by AMEU, Americans for Middle Eastern Understanding. It is written each month by Palestinians and Jewish writers who are not buying into the hype of AIPAC. And AIPAC's stranglehold on the government of this country and its commitment to the military, monetary and military help given to. Let me give you two other books that you would love reading. Dr. Martin Marty, my church history professor, told me I need to stop quoting people, because quoting people get me in trouble. Footnote, every time I see JWright said chickens are coming on the roof, I was quoting Ambassador Peck. I always leave that little phrase out. But Mark, M-A-R-C, Ellis. Now, I'll tell you how strong the AIPAC is. They just got him fired from Baylor. He was a professor there. He's a Jewish rabbi, M-A-R-C, Ellis. And they got him fired because of the last book he wrote. 25 years ago, he wrote a book towards the Jewish liberation of theology. And he says in that book, I got the inspiration and the trajectory for this book from black theologians. Right? But 2010, he wrote a book called Judaism is Not Israel. This is a Jewish rabbi. That the Judaism, the faith of Judaism is not the state of Israel. And too many people confuse those two as being simultaneous. The other as being simultaneous. The other author, I-L-A-N, I-L-A-N, Pape, P-A-P-P-E, I would recommend to you. He's a Jewish historian, Ilan Pape, P-A-P-P-E. And of his the one I would recommend to you is the one that probably will not allow him to go back home. Is titled is The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Now, just to have some fun, because I'm at the seminary, he, and you can Google this, I can't remember the man's name, there's a Catholic priest, but if you Google Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, the link, that same publication, you will find a very powerful study there done by a Christian biblical scholar who teaches in Jerusalem. He's a Catholic priest who argues that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine did not start, remember I'm having fun at the seminary, in 1948. It did not start in the 19th century as Pompey traces it. He said it starts in the Old Testament, where God told us to come in here, take over your land and kill everything, and don't even understand that confess against the Lord. That's where ethnic cleansing starts, in your Bible. He's a Bible professor. Other question? Would you probably say, can I go now? You all have a 7 o'clock class. Some of you have 7 o'clock class.
You mentioned that the church had done studies of hateful Kelvin's book. Do you do those book studies from the pulpit or in a separate?
No, we have a week-long church-wide study course classes taught each night. In fact, when Cain on Kelvin's book, Cain was not writing to church people, he was writing to an academic community. We had to take our seminaries had to take chapter by chapter and translate his theological language into ordinary church folk language so they could understand. And Cain not only liked that, he endorsed it, and as he would go around the country, he would hold up our study guide for lay people to look and get copies of that also to help them work their way through troubling biblical waters. No, I might mention him in the sermon, but arguments that scholars like Cain put forth are too involved to cover in a 30-minute sermon. So no, we have a church-wide study course where we would study the book for a whole week with different classes and lectures on a session each night, and then break up into classes. We're good to be in smaller groups to talk to each other about what we just heard.
Hello, good evening, Reverend Wright. My question is, a little bit earlier you spoke to this notion that Christians are apolitical. And I find that very interesting given our background in the civil rights movement and our grassroots organizing and how faith was really centered around politics then. So how do you take that piece of our history, in some cases that we've seen to move away from, how do you take that piece of our history and, I guess, reconcile it with the fact that Christians can be political? Like, how do we really address that issue where we're not just romanticizing the civil rights, but we're looking at civil rights issues today as the church and realizing that we do have a role in politics that goes beyond the four walls?
Thank you. I'll try to take a stab at it. When you say how do I reconcile it, I heard two different questions. How do you reconcile where we used to be with where we are now, or how do we close that gap from where we used to be to where we need to be now, or where we need to be going? The Christian education programs, well, there's several reasons. The first several layers to this response. The first layer has to do with the church. And remember, most people do not go to church. So when you start talking about addressing the church community, that's only a small segment of persons. But on the church level, the Christian education program of the church, James Washington, great church historian, pointed out that one of our problems is that we did not teach our story to our children. Where we used to be with where we are now, or how do we close that gap from where we used to be to where we need to be now, or where we need to be going? The Christian education programs, well, there's several reasons. The first several layers to this response. The first layer has to do with the church. And remember, most people do not go to church. So when you start talking about addressing the church community, that's only a small segment of persons. But on the church level, the Christian education program of the church, James Washington, great church historian, pointed out that one of our problems is that we did not teach our story to our children. So that our children have no clue. You can Google the Southern Poverty Law Center, civil rights, teaching the civil rights movement. 12 out of all of the high schools in America, a study that was done, 6% know anything about the civil rights movement. You go down to the monument, go to the monument. Now, one of King's quotes from 1967 is on that monument. They know, I have a dream. No, how about militarism, capitalism, racism? They don't know that King. All right? So that we don't teach not just, Jim Washington says, we need to teach our children like Jews do in synagogue school. We need to teach our children their story. So that's the church community. Moving beyond the church community goes to what we were talking about as we got out of the car tonight. I mentioned it, I think, either yesterday or, yesterday. The whole hip-hop community, the whole hip-hop world is another way of addressing that problem. Because folk who ain't never gone nowhere near church, haven't been in church, that conscious hip-hop artists addressing that world and closing the gap that way to help our young people know the story with which we've come. And what we need to do now in terms of human rights and how to connect the dots between what's going on in South Central, what's going on in the favelas in Brazil, what's going on in the townships in South Africa. How is it you got some black millionaires in Cape Town, some black millionaires in Rock Creek Park, and homeless folks sleeping across the street from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? How you going to connect those dots? The hip-hop community will reach a larger segment of young people in this country than church ever will, because they speak in a different language and can't speak the language they speak, or try to act like they get offended hearing them speak it publicly, and that's how we talk to our wives at home. Michael Eric Dyson, you quote Michael Eric Dyson, he said the church gets upset because the hip-hop artists call black women bitches, but the church treats them like bitches. The curriculum, addressing the curricular issues in public education is yet another way of bridging the gap and talking about moving forward in terms of human rights. And the obstacles are many. Have you heard of the commission or whatever it was called, the racism conference held in 2000 at Durban, South Africa? You know, you Google that, it's fascinating. All these countries in the world came together to look at racism, xenophobia, the problems in the year 2000. That's 13 years ago. Your country wouldn't send nobody. 10 years later, there was a Durban conference review. I was there. The United States wouldn't send nobody, because why? That document that was produced, and that was just a review. What have you done in 10 years with what we looked at 10 years ago? Because they call child slavery a crime against humanity. This country does not want to hear that. They don't accept that. They also call what's going on in Palestine apartheid. And because they wouldn't take it out of the document, we didn't send nobody to that. So when we start talking about how do you bridge together, how do you start talking about human rights worldwide, our country is one of the biggest blocks. I started to see you one night. I'm not preaching about this Sunday. I'm not preaching about that Sunday. I started to say this beautiful piece. I think I sent it to Bernard Richardson. You know, I have a dream. Yeah. There's an article that came out there that said, I have a drone. And the drone made your peace. It's the responsibility of thousands of innocent non-combatants killed. You know, walk around to t-shirts and I am the fulfillment of their dream. No, you're not. You're the opposite. But church-wide Christian education programs, curriculum-wide preschool, starting at preschool, that's what the schools that our congregation, they started a preschool education in terms of helping young people get a global generation for the kids leaving, 5-year-olds going into kindergarten. We had 2 5-year-olds who stood up and named all 54 countries on the continent. Those adults can't do that. In fact, we can't name 50 states in the United States. Starting in preschool, all the way into, they said, here you call the confusion of curriculum. In terms of infusing the curriculum, they got to pass the ACT and SAT, but infusing it with African-centered curriculum. Not saying that African-centered makes you better than anybody else. Talking from a different center. Acknowledging and recognizing and honoring the center of the Seminoles and the Sioux and the Apache, other centers, but helping them to connect us in that way academically, and trying to catch them before the third grade when most African American men drop out mentally because curriculum doesn't relate to anything remotely related to them. And the hip hop, those are the three things I'm saying in terms of layers, different ways, that's not exhaustive. But those are three different ways I can just think of off the top of my head that can address that problem in terms of helping future generations to see where we've come, where we are, and where we need to go. Several people have said that, so all of us are free. None of us are free. And well, who's not free? Let's look at who's not free. Let's talk about who's not free and why they're not free. One of the interesting lessons that they're teaching both in preschool and in Harvey and Bloom Academy, which is a charter school. Capitalism means you got to keep somebody poor. The only way you can have a prosperity gospel is to keep somebody poor. Now, who we gonna keep poor? You know, is that the point?
Thank you. Dr. Wright, the students would like to make a presentation at this time, so we can just pause for a moment. The Student Government Association. But they just want to honor. So please, Ms. Brown, go ahead.
This will be very quick. So, Reverend Wright, on behalf of the Howard University School of Divinity, the faculty, students, and the staff, we would like to present you just with the token of our appreciation for coming out this week and speaking to us about faith and, you know, the real world and what it means to be beacons of light. So we thank you for your work for justice and equality and just again for being with us tonight. Thank you.
Any more final questions before we go into paparazzi mode? No. Go ahead.
I'm just a person from the community. So I just want to make sure I'm clear. You changed the topic of the speech today. Is that correct, from the radical reconciliation to
That's the name
church?
of the book. That's the name of the book that Boesak and DeYoung, Curtis DeYoung and Alan Boesak wrote. They were here for convocation. So assuming that the students are already maybe work with me with their work, I wanted to talk about what that looks like in terms of the church locally, ordinary, not the academic community that they wrote about.
Okay. So then, you know, just the comment you just made about prosperity theology, and I'm not necessarily down for that or whatever, but, you know, your comment about, you know, keeping with that theology that means you got to keep somebody poor. I'm not, you know, promoting keeping anybody poor, but didn't Jesus say that we will always have?
No, he didn't. No, he didn't. That's taken out of context. Read Deuteronomy 15. He said you won't have poor if you take what you got and give it to him when you got nothing. That's when, until you read Deuteronomy 15, you sound like a media.
I'm not trying to get into a...
You said, didn't Jesus say what he said?
Right, well, I'm just saying, as a person who's not a divinity student,
that's what you got, and you got the wrong information. So I'm giving you the right information.
In the Bible that I have.
In the Bible that you have, look at the passage he quotes. I hope you got a study Bible, because when he said the poor you are with you should have a footnote to say Deuteronomy 15 is the passage he's quoting. Now, but read Deuteronomy 15, but don't take it out of context.
Right, so then my real issue is this concept of our theology, the thoughts that we're presenting versus our real and actual Christianity. And, just that tone that you presented.
What is our real actual Christianity? I don't know what you mean by that.
Your awareness of God and, what you believe about Jesus and salvation and, how you actually apply that in life. And part of the way that we do that, in a practical sense is our theology. But at some point, as God is moving in our lives, it moves us a little bit beyond our theology, in my opinion, beyond our theology. And so it's not a struggle, but, just that question of theology and, that center that we're coming from and it moving and growing. Once you get some awareness or success or, history moving, elevating beyond that while still holding some of that perspective. My thought is not fully developed, but just what you said kind of brought all that up.
Okay, thank you. You will never get away from your theology, because your theology is what you believe about God. Your theology will grow, it will evolve, it will devolve, but the question is, how do I see God? The simplification of this is my theology. This is how I see God. And how you see God is talking about real Christianity, or real Christianity. How my grandmother and grandfather saw God in the context of Surrey County, Virginia, that was racist and who worshiped God in the day wearing black robes and put on white robes at night. That ain't prosperity.
I'm not down.
That's persecution. What does God say about that? Or does your God get silent on that?
We have one more question, Dr. Wright.
Reverend Dr. Wright, retired missionary to Nigeria. I'm concerned about the census in the African countries. When a man converts to the Islamic faith, the whole family is counted as Christian. In Nigeria, the Hausa, the warfare with the oil industry was to make Nigeria a Muslim country, so that instead of being in OPEC, they would belong to OIC. My question is, does the ANC do any monitoring or lobbying for Christians, women and children caught up in that conflict?
Short answer is yes. Yes, they do. In fact, you can Google it to find out more about it. What's going on in Mali, for instance, right now, the ANC has taken a stand in terms of the women and children, those who are being ground under and crushed under by Islamicists, not Muslims. Islamicists who want Sharia law, who are, as Muslims, just like the Jewish community is not all lined up in step, lockstep with the Zionists. all the Muslim countries are not lined up with what's going on in parts of Nigeria. And those Islamists in Nigeria who will either become Muslim or will kill you. All Muslims don't think like that. All Muslims, remember, the ANC is made up of Muslims and Christians and Buddhists and a whole bunch of other folks. Coalition of South African Trade Unions, yeah, but they've taken a stance on that, and they're taking a position, and they have tried to mediate in the conflict. And I'm sure you know, because you were there, what happens in parts of Nigeria doesn't happen all over Nigeria. In some parts of Nigeria, Christians and Muslims not only get along well, they are married to each other and not trying to convert the other. The boy, if it's a boy, becomes a Muslim. If it's a girl, she's a Christian. In some families, among the Yoruba and the Igbo, my good friend whom I mentioned, Dr. Obukalu, has written extensively about that and about that conflict. But the ANC, yes, the ANC is involved. They're now a world partner involved in those kinds of human rights issues. That's a part of the problem they have in terms of the guys and girls on the street. They say, y'all getting involved in Nigeria, you're getting involved in Gaza, when are you gonna give us a house? In Guguletu. Y'all all over there solving their problems. When can we get some fresh water here in this township so that the people on the street are very different, in a different world from the people in government? The ANC government, yes, is involved in that on an international level. The ANC, you might know, I think probably do know, the ANC, because it was a government in exile, got intimately familiar with the governments in several other countries. It was Zimbabwe and Angola, and became on a first name basis with heads of states in Sweden, in England, in France. So that when it comes to those international issues, that ANC government leadership is very much involved in those discussions of human rights around the globe. Yes.
Let us thank
Thank you very much. We will have our reception outside. We'd like to spend a few more moments and more personal conversation with Dr. Wright. And he will be preaching in Untitled Chapter on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. If you want to hear him preach. And do come back and visit the Divinity School at our other events. Thank you for coming.